Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the museum. My name is Wendy Singer, and I am the Director of Education at the museum. On behalf of our staff, our volunteers, Board of Directors, Board of Trustees, including our CEO, Susan Abrams, our President, Fritzi Frischall, and our Chair of the Board of Directors, Jeff Pfeffer, I would like to welcome you all to the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center's Philip L. and Ellen V. Glass Holocaust Commemorative Series. For International Holocaust Remembrance Day, who said it would be easy? A conversation with Elizabeth Holtzman, the Congresswoman who brought Nazis to justice. Tonight we have the presence of many survivors, children of survivors, and grandchildren of survivors. If you are able, please take a moment and stand so we may honor you. Thank you so much. The United Nations General Assembly designated January 27th, the anniversary of liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, as the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. On this annual day of commemoration, the UN urges every member state to honor the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and millions of other victims of Nazism, and to develop educational programs to help prevent future genocides. 2020 is a very special year, as it marks the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, the ending of the Second World War, and the ending of the Holocaust. 2020 also marks the establishment of the United Nations, formed in response to the atrocity crimes of the Holocaust and the Second World War, with the aim of building a world that is just and peaceful. The 75th anniversary of liberation and the end of World War II provides an ideal opportunity to promote the museum's hopeful message while honoring both Holocaust survivors and the sacrifices of Allied forces. The museum will present a year-long public series of programs and educational programming, inviting audiences to reflect on the legacy of the Holocaust and World War II. Tonight's program is in partnership with CANDLES Museum in Terre Haute, Indiana. Welcome, Terre Haute, and we hope you're enjoying the program with us tonight. We are live streaming directly to a robust audience at the museum as we speak. A warm thank you to our Liberation 2020 series partner, the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, our Liberation 2020 media sponsors, the Chicago Reader, and we also thank our very special community partner for our entire year-long series, the Jewish War Veterans of the United States, Department of Illinois. Following the conversation, we will open up to a Q&A. If you have questions at the end of each row, there are note cards that can be passed down. Please take a moment, if you're on the end aisles on either side, to pass down cards for those who would like questions. We ask that the questions are then passed back to the end of the row so we may collect them, and they can be easily picked up. I now welcome our esteemed board member, Richard A. Solomon, to say a few remarks.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you all for being here. You can hear me okay? Yes. Wonderful. It's my distinct privilege to introduce our guest of honor before we start the Q&A, Elizabeth Holtzman. Let me put on my glasses here so I can, wonderful review here. Elizabeth is a Harvard-trained practicing attorney who has a distinguished record of government service, including 20 years as an elected official. During her 4 terms as a U.S. Congresswoman, she won national attention for her role on the House Judiciary Committee, where she voted to impeach President Richard Nixon and questioned President Gerald Ford about the Nixon pardon. She further chaired the Immigration and Refugee Subcommittee, where she co-authored with Senator Ted Kennedy the Refugee Act of 1980. She also co-founded the Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues and wrote many laws, including extending the deadline for ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment and the Rape Privacy Act. She was the first member of Congress to expose the U.S. government's inaction on Nazi war criminals living in America and spearheaded the effort to bring them, as Wendy said, to justice. When elected, Liz was the youngest member ever elected to Congress, a record she held for 42 years. Liz subsequently became the first woman elected district attorney of New York City, serving 8 years as DA of Kings County, Brooklyn, where she pioneered new strategies for the prosecution of sexual harassment and environmental crimes. Liz was also the first and only woman to be elected comptroller of New York City. Among many other appointments, in 2014, Liz was appointed to the Department of Homeland Security Advisory Committee. Liz resigned from that position thereafter to protest the policy of separating parents and children at the southwest border. Previously, Liz was appointed by President Bill Clinton to the Nazi and Japanese Imperial War Criminal Records Interagency Working Group, where she oversaw the declassification of more than 8 million pages of secret Nazi war crime files held by the U.S. government. Liz has written several books and many articles, including the most recent excellent book on impeachment. She regularly appears as a commentator on television, just on the other day, and has been featured in several movies, including Charles Ferguson's Watergate. She's also received many honors and 4 honorary degrees for her significant contributions to American politics. I'm delighted to welcome Liz, who's already on the stage, and may I say I'm proud to say that I get to call her a friend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything you want to start before I dive in?
Dive.
Dive. Well, tell us a little about your experience. You're 31 years old, and you are a new fledgling member of Congress, and as I believe I heard from you, a dossier was given to you about war criminals, Nazi war criminals living in the United States. Tell us about it a little and how it came to pass and what you did.
Okay, well, let me first start by saying, I should start by saying that I'm still recovering from a very, very bad cold, so if I cough or I lose my voice, please understand. Secondly, I think I can't understand my work on this issue, and I don't think you can without knowing a little bit of my background. My parents did not live through the Holocaust. Luckily, they left Europe much earlier. My dad's family was very poor, and they came here for economic opportunity from Poland, Belarus. My mom's family, however, came right after World War I and right after the communist takeover in the Ukraine. She lived through pogroms. I grew up with the stories of pogroms. So I knew several things. That life for a Jew was precarious. My mom's family was well off, but there were restrictions against Jews. Jews were not allowed to go to the gymnasium. There was a quota on Jews, but my mom passed through the tough exam and was admitted. Life was good there. But then after World War I, various armies came through. My grandfather was the only Jewish family my grandfather had enough money to buy a home, on a Christian street, the only Jewish family. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? So, because they were the only Jewish family on the Christian street, Jews who lived in the ghetto thought that it would be safe there, so Jews fled to my grandparents' house. And of course, that made it dangerous for everybody. And I grew up with stories. My mother said, I told my father, why are you letting Jews come in here? They'll be followed, and our lives will be in danger. And my grandfather said, no, if we can rescue anybody, we will. So those are the stories I grew up with. And then they had to leave. They fled. And they came to America. They had to leave everything. They fled in a caravan with people. My whole family was able to leave. But they came to America with nothing and started from the ground up. So I think many Jews have that story. Some more dangerous than others, some more benign than others. None, of course, as horrible as the Holocaust, but we know about precariousness. And we know about anti-Semitism, and we know about bigotry, and we haven't lived through it ourselves. Our parents have, or grandparents, or uncles, or siblings, or other relatives. So against that background, when I got to Congress, I was 31. I was the youngest woman ever elected. I didn't know that at the time. I never knew that there were Nazi war criminals in America. It was not something I had focused on or even understood or had any knowledge about. But it was the end of 1973. I was elected in 72, took office in 73. At the end of 73, somebody came to see me in Washington. He was not Jewish. He was connected in some way to the Immigration Service. I don't remember now exactly what the connection was. And he looked very normal. He dressed in a normal way. He wasn't seeing laser beams. He didn't tell me he was being followed by the CIA, but he did say that the US government had a list of Nazi war criminals living in the United States and was doing nothing about it. Those were crazy words to me, because I knew that the US had fought Hitler in World War II, and that tens of thousands of Americans gave their lives in that effort. And why would the US government allow Nazis to come here? Why would they allow them to stay here? It made no sense to me, but I couldn't get the idea out of my head. And because I was on the immigration subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee, we had to deal with the Immigration Service. So when the Immigration Commissioner came early in 1974 at a normal hearing where we ask about budget and we ask about other kinds of technical issues, I said, I'm going to ask him a question. And so I did. I said, is it true that the US government has a list of alleged Nazi war criminals living in the United States? And he said, yes. I almost fell off my chair, because usually government officials don't readily admit such serious kinds of things. So then I said, well, okay, my next question was, so what are you doing about it? That's when I heard this kind of cloud of words. Obfuscation and meaninglessness. And I knew that something bad had happened, but I didn't know what. So I said, I want to see the files. I had no idea whether I had a right to see the files or not, but I wasn't going to let this go now. Anyway, I went to New York where the files for some reason were, and they said they'd let me look at the files. And I started, there was kind of a gray metal desk, kind of you see in maybe Social Security office or some government office. and there was a stack of files, kind of like this, thin, very thin. And I opened the first file. I don't remember the name of the person, but I'll make up a name. It was the name of, let's say, Hans Schmidt. And then it would say allegation. Probably Schmidt isn't the right name because none of these were Germans. They were all Eastern Europeans. It was some Slavic name. He allegedly was a police chief in this town and responsible personally for the murder of hundreds of Jews. And then it said that the Immigration Service went to visit this man, knocked on his door. When he opened the door, the Immigration Service said, "Are you so-and-so?" And he said, "Yes." And they said, "How are you feeling?" He said, "I feel fine." They said, "Very good. Thank you very much. Bye." I said, "Okay, this is the first file." I said, "Something's wrong here, but this is the first file. Nothing else." I go to the next file. So this time it's not Hans, it's Ivan so-and-so. Same thing. Mayor of some town, we're responsible for rounding up Jews, identifying Jews, stealing their property. And then you see what action taken. Immigration Service goes to Ivan's home, knocks on the door. "Are you Ivan so-and-so?" "Yes, I am." "How are you feeling?" He says, "I feel fine." "Very nice, thank you very much, bye." I didn't go through all the files. I went through about 10 files. That was the content. I saw exactly what was happening, that the U.S. government, which is not the Immigration Service, which as we know today, and certainly was true then, is not a public health service. But all they were interested in was the health of these people. They had no interest whatsoever in following up on or investigating the allegations.
Continuing, Liz, let me just ask, so why is it you think that before you nobody probed or turned over these rocks?
Well, I can't answer for other people. All I know is when I discovered this, I wasn't going to stop because these people had committed crimes of enormous horror. U.S. government couldn't tolerate the presence of Nazi war criminals because what message were we sending to all Americans? That we tolerate the crimes they commit? I wasn't going to stand by. I also think that as I discovered later on, I didn't understand why they were here till much later, a few years, and actually as years went by and I learned more about it, I understood maybe some of the hesitation here was because people who came here the people who came here were mostly Nazi collaborators. Not all. U.S. government itself brought Nazi scientists, quote-unquote scientists, and others, and worked with Nazi spies abroad, brought some of them here. So, but most of them were collaborators from Eastern Europe, and they figured out that they could say, well, yeah, we were Nazis, but we weren't really Nazis. We were really anti-communists. That's why we did this. And of course, this was at the beginning of the Cold War, and that was, and so I guess people might have been afraid, members of Congress, that someone would call them a communist. I was called a communist by Bishop Trifa. That was a joke. I mean, it was laughable. By the time I did this, to call someone a communist was already laughable in the early 70s. So, but I can't really understand. I think it's also a question of just tenacity. Are you going to just do something political, quick, whatever, or are you really going to dig in and try to solve the problem? I saw some, in going through some of the files, I saw some letters later on to members of the U.S. Senate constituents would write and say, you know, I saw so-and-so on the street. I think he was a concentration camp guard at some concentration camp that I was at. And the senator, the congressperson, would send a letter to the Immigration Service saying, what's the story here? And the Immigration Service would write back and say, there's insufficient evidence to make that conclusion. Well, what kind of evidence do you have? They didn't follow up on that. There was no follow-up. Okay, you have some evidence, so what'd you do to find more evidence? So it was not, I don't know. I can't explain. Certainly this never should have happened. It could have been addressed many years before I got there. Maybe I didn't really understand what I was getting myself into. You know, sometimes fools step in where angels fear to tread. But I had to do the right thing, and this to me was the right thing. It took a number of years fully to address the problem. But I felt privileged to be able at least to start the process.
Well, thank God you did that, because at its apex, how many lawyers were in this unit in the Department of Justice?
Well, I don't really know the answer to that.
I read about 60 at one point.
It could be. I mean, what I did after I went through these files, I issued a press release in which I basically analyzed the problem and called for a remedy. I said, here's the problem. The U.S. government has a list of Nazi war criminals. It's doing nothing about it. And this is what they have to do. They have to create a special unit dedicated only to the mission of bringing these Nazi war criminals to justice. Number two, they had to do a worldwide search for documentation and evidence, because the evidence is not going to be in Skokie. It's not going to be in New York City. The documentation itself will be in some of the files that were seized by the Russians, or files that exist in Yad Vashem, or other places. The U.S. government never made a worldwide inquiry into documents. So I said there had to be a worldwide search for documents. I said there had to be a worldwide search for witnesses. They weren't even looking for witnesses in the U.S., much less anywhere else. So it had to be a serious, real, solid, professional investigation, as though you are investigating mass murderers, which is what they were investigating, and they were not doing it in that way. So, I mean, it took a little bit of time for the government to listen to me. They didn't want to, but I ultimately became chair of the immigration subcommittee, and then they really had to listen to me. I told them that the government, in response to my press release, did create a small unit in the Immigration Service, which was very dysfunctional at that time. And this unit couldn't operate because they couldn't get staples and they couldn't get things Xeroxed or papers, and it wasn't a very professional, it couldn't be a professional operation in that unit. So I said, we're going to create the unit in the Department of Justice, in its most prestigious unit, which is in the criminal division, and they said no. And I said, well, you can say no, but it's going to be done either with your consent or I'm going to write it into law.
Let me stop you there for a moment, because I think although early in the interview, this is a placeholder. Here we are on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and it's worth noting that it takes a 31-year-old woman who maybe had an extra year or two by the time she completed this, who turned over rocks that no one else did, and that is the concept in this museum of being an upstander, a proactive, positive force for change. So join me in, acknowledging that. And I don't know how much you want to go into it otherwise, but I know some of your colleagues in the Senate basically said, don't worry about it, and never took an active interest themselves.
Right, but I want to say, by the time I got involved, I did several things in which members of the Senate were very helpful, in particular Senator Ted Kennedy, because one of the things I did do before I created the unit was to strengthen the U.S. laws on deporting Nazi war criminals. It's called the Holtzman Amendment for short. And I wrote the bill in the House, and Senator Kennedy introduced it and passed it in the Senate. So I can't say people didn't help. And he was a great senator, and I want to thank him for that.
While we're on it, in those early years, did you personally witness anti-Semitism in Congress at all, or not?
Well, I think so. not dirty Jew kind of anti-Semitism, not like when I was growing up in Brooklyn. I was just telling, was it your wife? Yeah, that Patty, he must have been about 8 or 9, and my twin brother and I were about 7, and when we would walk to Hebrew school, he would always threaten to beat us up, dirty Jews. I mean, we were 7, he was 9, but it wasn't that overt, but yes, there were, I remember 2 incidents. One, and they were both kind of similar in the kind of attack. One was, there was a forum on bombing of Cambodia was taking place, and there was an effort to shut down the bombing of Cambodia, and the Nixon years were going on, and there were questions about presidential abuse of power. And there was a forum that was being televised, maybe on PBS in Philadelphia, where the convention was held, where the Constitution was written, and it was about Constitution and presidential powers. And I started to talk about how Congress had to play an important role in checking war-making powers. And at that time, he wasn't President Bush at that point, but he was the head of the Republican Party. He looked down at me and sneered and said, "You wouldn't be saying that if we were talking about Israel." So it was quite clear that he was raising a dual loyalties issue. I was astonished, surprised. And I said, it doesn't matter what country we're talking about, we still have to have a democracy, and we still have to obey the Constitution. And I was confronted with a similar kind of crack by a member of Congress once, also in raising the issue of dual loyalties. But other than that, I never experienced it in Congress. Of course, I did get some anti-Semitic letters, and of course, I once got a phone call in Washington. This was, I laugh about it. It wasn't so funny, but I laugh about it. I still laugh about it. A heavy breathing phone call from a guy with a very heavy New Jersey accent, different from Brooklyn accent. And he said, "Holtzman?" I said, what is it you're calling about? And he said, "You know, if your life is worth anything, you better stay out of Bayonne." I said, "Only Bayonne, I'm okay."
While we're on the subject of anti-Semitism, obviously, I'd be remiss not to ask, there has been a rise, obviously, in anti-Semitism and hate crimes in the United States and around the world. I know when we did a program together at the Association of the Bar of the City of New York, you were asked about it. What's your long-term perspective on how to perceive this and how to address it? Here we are in the 75th anniversary of liberation.
Well, I have to say I'm really very honored to be here on the 75th anniversary to pay respects to the memory of the Jews who were assassinated, to the fact that, and we need to remember this, it wasn't only Jews who were the victims of this vicious, horrific hatred. The hatred was so great that it spilled over, so millions of non-Jews were killed in this process. I think the important thing to remember from the Holocaust for everybody is that whoever the target is, that kind of hatred creates a risk for everyone. No one is safe when bigotry rides the night, that's for sure. So I'm actually astonished at where we are. I mean, I grew up with not only Patty trying to beat us up on the way to Hebrew school, but when I went out to Long Island, sometimes there'd be big signs, no Jews, dogs, blacks allowed. So I saw that But this country was a sanctuary for my parents, particularly my mother's family fled as refugees. So it was we never thought, we went into a synagogue, that we would be killed. Never. And today, who could go to an event even like this without some kind of dark shadow across your mind saying, could it happen here? So what's happened to this country? And it's no answer to put a police officer in front of every synagogue, in front of every Jewish gathering. That's not an answer. How do we root out this hatred? Education is really important. That's why this museum, Rick did an amazing job in showing me the museum itself, which is really impressive. I had no idea of the quality of the exhibits, the extent of the exhibits, the fact that it's interactive, so young people coming out can figure out ways to combat bigotry. I was very impressed with those things. So education is a big part of it. But it's also our culture and our political leadership. We cannot have, from the highest office of our land, somebody say that there are fine people on both sides when one of those sides is saying Jews will not replace us. We cannot temporize with anti-Semitism or bigotry of any kind. When we demonize the immigrants, who are we demonizing? If there's a list of bad people, Jews may not be the number one on that list, and we may not be number two, but if there is such a list, we are on it. Let's not kid ourselves. So we have to create a society and stand up for a society that respects all people, that values all people, and that celebrates the difference between us or among us. That's what we have to work for, and that's a huge job, but it can be done. I mean, that's one of the points I wanted to make about tonight, which is how much difference each person can make. When you think about what a Nazi war criminal who actually participated in the murder of Jews, what kind of poison they spread in this society, and then you think about how you combat that, how much one person teaching love and respect and demonstrating that as an example in their lives, how much goodness that creates. That's what we have to do. And we have to speak out against anti-Semitism. One person can make a difference. I didn't know what I was getting into with the Nazi war criminals, but once I started, I couldn't let go. And I was able, one person, to change a situation of complete indifference, tolerance of Nazis, and change it into a situation where the United States did an extraordinarily effective job in dealing with the problem even 40 years after the crimes were committed, and more than 40 years. So we have to stand up, and we can't tolerate, and we can't excuse, and we can't say, oh, you know, this reason and that reason and whatever, and we can't be silent. And we have to teach. And, you know, they say in the Haggadah, in every generation they rise up against us. But we're still here, and we're still going to be here. And if we stand up, we will always be here. That's my message. Each one of us can make that difference.
Thank you for those words. Related to that, Liz, if you would, given that it is the 75th anniversary of liberation, what is, to you personally, most important to remember about the Holocaust, as sadly our first generation survivors are not going to long be with us still?
I don't know if there's a most important thing. To me, one of the things I learned as I began to read more and more about the Holocaust and try to understand what happened is, and I guess I was kind of confronted with it in a way that I didn't really like when Hannah Arendt wrote this book about Eichmann in Jerusalem and kind of almost blamed the Jews for what happened during the Holocaust and for not resisting. But I think one of the things that, to me, is very important to remember is that you can resist, and Jews did resist the Nazis in so many different ways, that we have to understand the strength and character that it took. Not just some Jews were fortunate enough to be able to escape into the forests or the marshes and find others and get guns and fight back with weapons. That was a relatively small number. Others, how did they fight back? They could have run away. They didn't. They stayed with their parents to help them. Others just survived. That was a fighting back. So that the experience of Jews in the Holocaust, the dealing with the evil, this immense evil that we even today cannot comprehend. You cannot denigrate the victims, and you cannot minimize the strength of their resistance and the various ways they stood up against it. And we have to honor that.
Well said. Earlier in my introduction, I mentioned how you stepped off the Homeland Security Advisory Committee over how we were treating refugees at the southwest border. Were there others who joined with you in that, or was that?
There were only 4 others. 3 others. There were
out of how many?
Maybe 20 people on the committee. And that's when I said, you know, there's a time for silence and there's a time for speaking out. And initially, when I thought about doing it, people said, well, you know, if you stay on that committee, maybe you can change things. But I saw there was no way to change things. And I didn't want in any way, shape, or form to endorse, legitimize what they were doing. So I was glad that there were 3 others as a result of the fact that there were 4 of us who resigned. It did make the press, so there was some sense that, yes, there were people in government who also oppose this, but it would have been great if everybody resigned. Just as everybody resigned from the Business Council when the President of the United States said what he said about Charlottesville. So that's why resistance in all kinds of ways can make a difference, because it sets an example for other people about what you're giving up. But how are you giving anything up if you are a participant in evil? You can't. You're getting yourself away from it, and you're making a moral statement, and maybe people will learn from it. So it's very important to do those things. I don't know that we've succeeded. And I, of course, am very sad about this whole problem, because I remember when Ted Kennedy and I wrote the Refugee Act of 1980, I was actually inspired to do that because of what happened during the Holocaust, when the United States government denied entry to the United States. It wasn't only the St. Louis, the passengers on the St. Louis, but consul generals all over Europe could have issued visas. They refused to do that. So that's one of the reasons I was inspired to do it, and also because of what happened during the Vietnam boat people exodus. And so I saw that bill passed with almost no objection in the House and the Senate. It was the first time the U.S. government had a comprehensive program for the admission of refugees, in large part due to the experience, to overcome the experience of the Holocaust. And we admitted in the Vietnamese boat people exodus, the U.S. admitted close to 1 million Vietnamese refugees. Was there an outcry? Were people panicked? Did this country think we were going to, be overwhelmed, that somehow this would destroy America? Nobody felt that way. It was handled in the normal course. And now we get panicked at the idea that 2,000 children will come to this country. So I'm very saddened about what's happened to America. And I think our values are really, really deeply under attack. And we've got to fight back, because we saw what happened in Europe. And I thought it could never happen here. But if you ask me today, can it happen here? I'm not so sure I could say it could never happen here.
Let me shift gears for a minute. I actually ran into it at an event Jackie and I were at last week in New York City with someone you know, the former borough president of New York, Ruth Messinger, who actually has spoken at this museum and told me she was a roommate of yours at...
No, classmate.
Classmate, okay, at Radcliffe. And she said I should ask you a little more about your parents and the values that you had growing up, what led you. We're about to have an exhibit down the hall here, the life and times of the notorious RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, on becoming a lawyer, you know, when it wasn't as common a path. So speak a little to your parents' values, the importance of education, and how it is you became a lawyer, if you would.
Well, it wasn't just my parents. My grandparents were also very much in favor of education. My grandfather was, as my mom used to tell me, really thrilled that she was able to get into the gymnasium in Russia. That was a moment of enormous pride for him. In fact, one of the reasons that they left was when the communist government took over, they threw my mom out of school and said, you're a member of the bourgeoisie, you can't stay here anymore. And so my grandfather saw there's no future, there's no economic future, and his children can't get an education, there's no other future, and not to mention the pogroms. So it was a big combo. But education was really important, and not just education for boys, it was education for girls as well. My grandfather wanted my mom to have an education. He was proud that she was educated. She got a PhD, and she was a professor. So I was raised with the idea of the importance of education. But more important than even education was the idea that you stood up for something. And you stood up for Jewish people. I mean, the experience of my grandfather, I can't imagine that kind of courage, to sacrifice even your own family for strangers to come into your house and give them sanctuary. So not on one occasion, but on a number of occasions. So to me, that was a big example that you have to stand up. I'm not saying everybody's going to risk their lives and their families' lives, but to stand up against evil and to stand up for Jewish people, was really important. And how did I become a lawyer? I kind of fumbled into it. Harvard Law School accepted me right away, didn't really want to be a lawyer. So ultimately other things didn't work out, so that's what I decided to do.
Well, that's a pretty good fallback, if I may say.
Right. Well, you didn't have to write. The reason that Harvard Law School made it was easy for me was because you didn't have to write an essay for Harvard Law School about why you wanted to go to Harvard Law School. I didn't want to go to law school, so I couldn't. This is a true story, but
go back to your childhood. Were there any formative experiences you remember of taking a stand for social justice early on, you know, given the path that you clearly have pioneered and forged since then?
Well, I wouldn't say when I was a child, but when I went to law school, this was very formative for me. When I went to law school, a white lawyer who was a civil rights lawyer in Mississippi came up to Harvard Law School and gave a talk about what it was like to represent James Meredith, who had integrated the University of Mississippi, and he had represented James Meredith. And he said there were only about 8 or 10 people in that audience, why don't you come down south and help out? And that sounded kind of interesting and important to me because I knew that there was segregation in the South, but what I didn't know was how dangerous it was and how bad it was and what it was like. So my parents had no objection. They thought it was a good idea, but they didn't know either what it was like. And of course, this was the year before Schwerner and Cheney and Goodman were assassinated, so this was a time when federal government was not on the side of those people, of the civil rights workers. And I worked for a black civil rights attorney. And I remember calling home. I couldn't stay. None of us who were working in the civil rights movement could stay in the white part of town. It was too dangerous, so we had to stay with black families. And I remember calling home and telling my mom that we were being followed by the police. She thought I'd gone nuts. But what I saw, I couldn't believe. Black people had to get off the sidewalk when white people walked down the sidewalk. I was in southwest Georgia, which is right next to the border of Alabama, which was just about as bad as Mississippi, and it was really dangerous. There was no protection from the federal government. Segregation was rampant. They closed down, I'll never forget this, they closed down the swimming pool for black, there were segregated swimming pools, and they opened up a white-only swimming pool, and they would not let black children swim in it. And you can imagine how hot it was in the summer, and I remember seeing these black children, toddlers, kids, standing at the iron fence, looking in and seeing the white kids swim. It was pretty horrible and amazing and very, very troublesome to me. And that was a very formative experience because I saw, not in terms of standing up to injustice, but I saw that people could actually defeat injustice, because what happened in the South, it was mostly kind of high school kids. They'd be singing before these demonstrations. They'd be filled with enthusiasm, and their eyes would be lit up, and they would go into these very peaceful marches, and they knew they'd be arrested, and they knew they'd be in jail, and they knew they'd be completely at the mercy of the sheriff with the cattle prods and the dogs and all the rest, and they were not afraid. And ultimately, that courage brought those walls down. So that taught me a lesson too, that it wasn't futile. It's not futile. You can make a difference. They taught me that.
But we need to do another bookmark here, because your own courage in that is extraordinary in many ways, because if you think about it, how many people in your law school class chose the path that you went on? And may I add to that, how many would have had their parents be accepting of you going to the South, where you're talking about people being beaten or killed?
Oh, we didn't know that was going to happen. I'm not a very courageous person. I didn't know what I was getting into, okay? I don't think I would have gone down there if I had known how dangerous it was. In fact, when I got down, and I don't think my parents would have fought tooth and nail had they had any idea. They said, "This is America. This can't happen here." But it was. I think the important thing is that there were a few of us at Harvard Law School, maybe 4 or 5 in my class of 500.
I was going to say, I'm a product of the same law school, and a lot of people ended up going to corporate law. So.
Yeah, well, but you know, the important thing was that a bunch of us, there weren't many, maybe 10 or 15 of us from Harvard, Yale, and Columbia, we got together after that summer, and we said, we can't do nothing. And so we formed an organization, and we brought other law students down, because we said, if people see this, it's a little bit like we were talking about in this museum. If people see this, if they know the horror of what's going on, they will do something about it. So we wanted to expose other law students around the country in America to the horrors of what was going on, the horrors of what was going on in the South. And we did. So first year we brought down 40 or 50 law students, and then more and more and more. And that was also an important way of education. So there are a lot of things that make a difference. The courage, education, and not giving up. And that's what was important. So, but I don't overemphasize the courage on my part. I don't think I would have gone. I'm sure I wouldn't have gone if I had any idea.
Would you say that your work in the South and with civil rights attorneys helped lead you to a career in public service? Because you obviously moved rather strongly in that direction.
Yes, because the experience in the South showed that you can make a difference. It's not just the need to stand up, but standing up can change things for the better. And I saw that with my own eyes. So, yes, that's what gave me the inspiration to do it. I said, I think I can make a difference. I tried to.
Well, you certainly have. Let me ask, while they're collecting cards, one other question. because this was mentioned to me also by Ruth Messinger. And some of you are older enough to remember this, and that has to do with there was, I think while you were in Congress, an Abscam investigation with the FBI trying to probe corruption by congressmen and women. And I don't know if it was the FBI or a fellow defendant who had said, well, we can't go after Liz Holtzman because she's, I don't know what the phrase was, these are either squeaky clean or not subject to being corrupted. Speak to that.
So, I didn't know this at the time, but this was when I was chairing the immigration subcommittee, and the FBI was doing this investigation, and they dressed up as Arab sheiks to see if members of Congress could be bribed to introduce private immigration bills. And in a trial in South Carolina, one of the congressmen who was indicted and prosecuted said that he'd been asked, for accepting a bribe, said that he'd been asked by the FBI, dressed up as Arab sheiks, whether, who else they should try to go after. And according to him, he said to them, don't bother with Holtzman, she's too honest to trust. So I guess if the crooks say it about you, maybe there's some validity, I don't know. So, but I didn't know that at the time, I had no idea. I knew that, when they reported the results of Abscam, I was horrified about it, but I didn't know that they had even thought about targeting me in that, so. But one other thing I want to mention, by the way, I know we talked about it in the introduction, but more than just having this, and going back to Nazi war criminals and what happened, I think is also very important to bear in mind. Not only did we change the law, not only did we create a special professional bureau in the Justice Department, the Office of Special Investigations, but I mentioned to you I didn't understand why the U.S. government had brought Nazi war criminals here and why they had tolerated them. And so I didn't want to do that at the time because I said, time is not on our side. These people are getting older. We have to move against the Nazi war criminals, and we can find out why this problem was created later. The first thing to do is to see that they're brought to justice. And later on, we were able, in a bipartisan way, to get legislation through the House and Senate, creating a special monitoring position and also creating special standards in the law to require the U.S. government to make public the classified information that they had on Nazi war criminals. It took us about 7 or 8 years to accomplish that task, but 8 million pages of materials were made public on U.S. involvement with Nazi war criminals. We tried to be comprehensive. It may not be the whole story because there's no button you can push that says Nazi war criminals and automatically all the papers come out. But we used historians and we fought very hard against the CIA, which did not want to release a lot of information. But ultimately that information was released, what we could find out about. And I think for the most part the agencies did cooperate. It's very important to see this lesson because this is something to bear in mind. After World War II, and we know this from these documents, we knew it in other ways, but these documents confirm it, the U.S. government worked with Nazi war criminals both in the United States and abroad, and they did so because, quote unquote, the ends justified the means. The ends were fighting the Cold War against Russia, and they were using Nazi war criminals to do that. Now, of course, fighting the Cold War or resisting Russian expansionism was definitely not an unworthy cause. But the idea that you can defeat an evil with another evil, it made no sense. And actually, morally, it made no sense. And it actually was practically harmful. I don't know, maybe we should answer questions, but if anybody wants me to go into this, I'll be happy to do that. You want me to? Okay, well, I'll give you the best example. Stop and think about, after World War II, the Nazis figured out that if they said they were anti-communists, the U.S. would say, oh my goodness, you know, really, we need your help. And of course, some of them said, well, we really know about Russia and communism because we fought on the Eastern Front. Well, guess what? Who lost on the Eastern Front? The Nazis, so you would want their military experts to tell us something? Okay, that's number one. Number two, what were they really doing on the Eastern Front? Killing Jews and killing the Roma, Sinti. So they were involved in mass murder. What did they have to teach us? But the U.S. nonetheless was, I don't know, kind of a romantic notion. Oh, you know, we use these Nazis. They're really tough guys, and they're really going to help us with the Russians. So we set up an organization. Somebody asked me about this before. A guy called Reinhold Gehlen. And we set him up as the head of the equivalent of the spy service in West Germany. And Reinhard Gehlen was in charge of army intelligence for the Nazis, for the Wehrmacht, on the Eastern Front. So we know what he knew and was involved in. And of course, when he started his spy service, who did he bring in? The people who worked for him. The people also on the Eastern Front, the people who were involved in the mass murder of Jews and knew about it and had their hands deep in blood. Well, stop and think about those people. If you're going to be a spy against the Russians are going to know who you're using. They're going to have stuff to blackmail Gehlen and Gehlen's people because they had blood on their hands, and they could expose them. We didn't stop to think about this. We just said, oh my goodness, they have expertise on the Russian front. So the Russians penetrated Gehlen's operation, and I think it was the number 2 person on Gehlen's spy service who was a double agent, because the Russians were able to blackmail him because he had been involved in mass murder on the Eastern Front. Well, it took a few years for the U.S. to figure out that this guy was a double agent and before they got rid of him. And when they did an analysis, which is something we found out when we were examining these papers, the U.S. government said, big problem using Nazi war criminals as spies, big problem. Think about it. Not only a moral issue, but a practical issue. I mean, maybe there was a good side to it, because maybe if the Russians knew what we were doing, they wouldn't take military steps that they didn't need to take, so maybe it actually averted warlike efforts or wartime efforts or whatever. But that's part of the story. I mean, the whole story is really worth reading about because it shows the extent to which, even just after the concentration camps were over, even while the Nuremberg trials were going on, the U.S. government secretly was working with mass murderers, Nazi war criminals, both in Europe and in the United States. And now that story is mostly out. There have been some books that have been written about it. I just was mentioning one to Rick Solomon by Eric Lichtblau. But it's worth reading because it shows how we can't always even trust the United States government to do the right thing.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, we have quite a few questions here, so let me run through a couple related to your original Nazi crime-fighting days, and then take it a little farther. First question is, what was the motivation of the person, if you know, who brought you the dossier about the list?
I don't really know. I think the person was Armenian, and as probably some of you in this room know, Hitler said, well, the Turks had engaged in a genocide against the Armenian people in Turkey, and Hitler said, well, if the world didn't care about the genocide against the Armenians, why would they care about the Jews? So I think it's because, I don't know for sure that he was Armenian. He had an Armenian-sounding name. But he was very troubled as an American and as a human being, not as a Jew, as an American and as a human being, that the U.S. government had allowed Nazis to come here and was tolerating their presence. Why he picked me out, I don't know.
Well, he made a good choice.
Yeah, I guess so, in retrospect.
Related question, did your early actions and statements alert any Nazi criminals to go into hiding, to your knowledge?
No, I think the interesting thing about the Nazi war criminals is that they were brazen. They never changed their names. I mean, John Demjanjuk, he didn't change his name. Werner von Braun, he didn't change his name. Arthur Rudolph, who worked 20,000 slave laborers to their deaths at Dora slave labor camp, prisoner of war camp, where they made the missiles, that they were rockets. He never changed his name. They thought they were safe here. They thought nobody would do anything to them. Remember, I started my work in 1974. They'd been here since 45. Nothing happened to them. They were astonished. So, I mean, could some of them have gone into hiding? It's possible. We'll never know. But I think most of them never changed their name. There was a man living in California called Andrija Artukovic. He was the interior minister of Croatia, a Nazi puppet state, where hundreds of thousands of people were sent to concentration camps and murdered, and Jews, Gypsies, Serbs. He lived here openly. He was the interior minister. He was a big shot Nazi collaborator. He didn't hide it. What does it tell you about what was happening in this country for all of those years? Anyway, he was sent back to Yugoslavia. And the Yugoslavs committed to do a trial, and they did a trial. He was convicted, and he died on appeal. But he was extradited from the United States and brought to justice, in my opinion. So they don't change. They were brazen, and they thought they were safe here, and they were.
A related question was, how cooperative was the executive branch of the government in your effort to bring Nazis to justice? I'm sorry.
You could pass the mic back and forth so they don't...
Okay, I'm sorry. How cooperative was the executive branch of the government in your efforts to bring Nazis to justice, Liz?
I would say, the Justice Department wasn't really happy about creating a special, the Office of Special Investigations in the Criminal Division. But, after being browbeaten, they did accept it. And I have to say, I was skeptical at the beginning, but for the most part, the executive branch did the right thing. So I really can't complain too much about it. I will tell you one story. I call it the Passover plot, where, and this involves a little bit of a confession. I hope there's no rabbi in this room. But what happened was that I had left government in 1981, Congress, and this was 1984 or 5. And someone called Carl Linus had just been prosecuted and convicted by not prosecuted, but the government had sought to denaturalize him and deport him. And the case had gone up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and he was about to be deported. And he was going to be deported to Estonia, because the concentration camp was in Estonia. And Linus was accused of actually having shot Jews personally as they were on. He was one of the top administrators of this camp, and he also was involved in personally shooting Jews. It was the first day of Passover, and usually I observe the holiday, but for some reason I had to go to my office, and I stopped in my office. I was district attorney of Brooklyn at that point, to pick up some papers. And as I was walking into my office, the phone rang from Washington, and I was told that the number 2 person in the Justice Department was about to persuade the Panamanian government, I'm sorry, to accept Carl Linus so that he could be deported there rather than Estonia, so that he could live the rest of his life on a nice beach with nice weather instead of going back to Estonia to be prosecuted by the Russians. So I didn't leave the office right away. We started a major effort. Of course, all the Jewish organizations' offices were closed because it was the first day of Passover, which is why the government did it on that day, because they expected no one to be around, and it almost worked. Except somehow we managed to give the impression to the Panamanian embassy in Washington and the Panamanian embassy at the UN, and alert the press that this would create a huge outcry in the United States. And so we said we were on the plane to go to the Panamanian embassy in Washington. By the time we left New York and arrived at the embassy doorstep, the embassy said, we're not taking Carl Linus to Panama. And Carl Linus went off to Estonia to be prosecuted by the Russians, jailed immediately. So, yes, could the government do something devious like that? Definitely. And they did, but they got foiled, so.
Liz, before we move into a few other areas quickly, 2 other questions of related vintage. Were you ever made aware of any Nazi war criminals in the United States who were used to accelerate our atomic bomb technology and program? And second, someone wants to volunteer in terms of searching for Nazis. Are they still living to your, so 2-part question.
Well, the Nazis, some of the Nazis who were here, like Arthur Rudolph, who was not a scientist, just an engineer, they were involved with the space program, no question about it, and even but they weren't involved in nuclear research, as far as I know. Arthur Rudolph, and there was a man called Herbert. His last name was Strugold, and he did experiments, quote-unquote, medical experiments on people to determine what would happen with no gravity to their bodies and what would happen if it was extreme cold or they were kept in ice, or, you can figure out all the good things that he could do. And he was in charge of that, and he worked for the U.S. government also as a scientist. In fact, the U.S. government brought 1,600 Nazi, quote-unquote, scientists here. And not only the Nazis, we also worked with the Japanese who conducted biological experiments, and we also wanted to take advantage of their quote-unquote scientific research. So our hands are pretty dirty about that stuff. But I'm not aware of anything that was done with regard to nuclear weapons, not as far as I know. As far as the search for Nazi war criminals, I mean, the Office of Special Investigations is still there, subsumed under an agency that's now focused on larger issue of human rights, not only Nazi war criminals. I guess there's work that, I don't know if they accept volunteers, but basically the search for Nazis, I wouldn't say is completely over, because information comes up from time to time, information from other governments, but I don't know that there are opportunities to do volunteer work on that. Or paid work. I don't.
Another question from the audience, was your life ever threatened?
Yes, about Bayonne, but I haven't been to Bayonne since then.
And Bayonne, New Jersey, for those of you.
Yeah, not France.
Right.
I don't want that. That would be serious, but Bayonne, New Jersey, different story.
All right, let me put my glasses on for this one. Do you feel hopeful, it's asked, that average citizens can fight against lobbyists and against corrupt government officials, and if so, how?
Well, as I said from my experience before, I saw these young people, primarily young people in the South, stand up against a whole system. It wasn't just a powerful lobbyist, it was a whole system, including the police, the courts, the apparatus of law enforcement to prevent any effort to change the segregated system in the South. And those walls came tumbling down. So, yes, we can succeed. It's not going to be easy. None of these, very few things that are really worth doing are easy to accomplish. That was extremely hard. And lives were lost in that process. Let's not forget, not only Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, but Viola Liuzzo and others. People were beaten. Yeah, it's a risky business, less risky to fight lobbyists and big corporations, but it can be done. And there are various groups that fight for ensuring that people's voices are heard, not just the moneyed interests, whether it's Common Cause, or I don't mean to single them out only, but there are other groups like that you could find, and there are candidates running for office right now, and some of them believe in these issues, and working for them is also an important way of magnifying your own voice and helping others who want to accomplish this task.
And let me end with a rhetorical question. It's not my question, but I would share in it, and it's a good way to close the evening. Can you please run for president? Please join me, though, in really welcoming and honoring a true upstander, Congressman Elizabeth Holtzman.
Thank you so much, Rick, and thank you, Congresswoman Holtzman, for this amazing evening and your insight. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Thank you to Candles for joining us tonight. We hope you enjoyed the program. We have an incredible lineup of our 2020 Liberation programs and, of course, our incredible lineup for the notorious RBG here in red. On the 20th of each month, we have free days in honor of Liberation 2020. If you have a moment, if you could please fill out the survey underneath your chairs. It helps us to make sure that we're on the mark for you guys, as well as giving important feedback to funders. Thank you so much for a meaningful evening, and have a good night.